The sky was dark, filled with thick clouds, as the soldier made his way through the dense forest. His boots made soft, crunching sounds on the wet ground as he pushed through the underbrush. His name was Ethan, a trained soldier sent on a top-secret mission. He wasn't alone in this forest. A war was brewing, and his team was out there somewhere, hiding, waiting for orders. But there was something more important now, a life to save. Ethan had been briefed on the mission. An alien princess had crashed near Earth, and the enemy forces were closing in fast. She was important, not just because of her status, but because of the secrets she held. If she was captured or killed, Earth could be in danger. The mission was clear: find the princess and protect her at all costs. As Ethan moved deeper into the forest, he could hear the sounds of distant gunfire and the shouts of battle. The war was everywhere, even in this peaceful-looking place. The dense trees above blocked out much of the light, making everything look shadowed and mysterious. It wasn't a place for humans, but it was her home. Suddenly, he heard something, a soft rustle in the bushes. His hand instinctively reached for his weapon, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He had been trained to expect the unexpected, but what he saw ahead was something he wasn't ready for. There, lying among the ferns, was the alien princess. Her silver-blue skin shimmered in the dim light, and her large pointed ears made her look like someone from a dream, not Earth. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow, her clothes torn from the crash. Despite the beauty of her features, Ethan could see the exhaustion and pain on her face. His heart raced. He had found her, but she was in no condition to move. Ethan rushed to her side, dropping to one knee. Her alien eyes fluttered open, and she stared at him for a long moment, confused and wary. She hadn't expected to be rescued by a human. You're human," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with an edge of surprise. Ethan nodded. "I'm here to help you," he said softly, trying to reassure her. "We don't have much time. The enemy is close." The princess blinked, trying to sit up, but a sharp pain caused her to gasp. She winced, clutching her side. Ethan quickly moved to support her, placing her arm over his shoulder as he helped her to her feet. Despite her alien strength, she was clearly injured and weak. "Thank you," she murmured, though it was clear she didn't fully trust him yet. The tension between them was palpable. She had heard stories of humans, brave but often selfish, unpredictable. Still, in this moment, he was her only chance. Ethan gently helped her move through the forest. They needed to get out of sight. He had heard rumors that the enemy was tracking her, and he couldn't risk being ambushed. He glanced around, trying to stay calm, but inside, his thoughts were racing. This wasn't just about protecting her. It was about survival, Earth's survival. The princess held secrets that could change the course of the war, and if she fell into the wrong hands, everything could be lost. "You must be wondering why I'm here," Ethan said as they walked. "I'm part of a team sent to protect you. We've got a safe house nearby." The princess didn't reply immediately. She looked around the dense trees, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Her eyes, once cold and distant, seemed to soften a little as she met his gaze. She could feel his sincerity, but her thoughts were still clouded with confusion and distrust. She had been betrayed by her own people before. Could she truly trust a human? Ethan kept his pace steady, glancing at her from time to time. She was beautiful in an alien way, her long, silvery hair cascading over her shoulders, and her smooth skin almost glowing. But beneath that beauty was a fierce warrior, a leader who had likely never relied on anyone but herself. They moved quickly, using the cover of the trees to stay hidden. Every now and then, Ethan heard something in the distance, footsteps, voices, but each time, they managed to stay out of sight. They were close now to the safe house, but the princess was growing weaker, her steps slower. "We're almost there," Ethan said softly, "just a little further." But as he spoke, there was a sudden noise, a loud crack in the distance, followed by shouting. The princess tensed, and Ethan's heart sank. The enemy was close, much closer than he'd hoped. Without thinking, Ethan scooped her into his arms, holding her tightly. She was startled by the action, but before she could protest, he was already running. The forest blurred around him as he sprinted through the trees, his heart pounding in his chest. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. They were being hunted. "Hold on," Ethan whispered urgently, his voice barely audible over the crashing of his footsteps. "We'll make it." The princess clung to him, her breath shallow but steady. There was no time for words now. Only action. Only survival. Ethan's heart raced as he ran through the thick forest, the princess still cradled in his arms. The sound of enemy footsteps echoed behind them, growing closer with every passing second. He had to get her to safety, but the path ahead was unclear. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, dark and filled with shadows, making it difficult to see what was coming. "Hold on," he whispered again, trying to reassure her, though his own voice shook. His breath came out in short bursts, his muscles burning from the exertion. The princess was light, but carrying her while running through the forest was no easy task. The princess didn't say anything. She was quiet, her silver-blue eyes scanning their surroundings, alert to every sound, every movement. Ethan could feel her body tense against him, ready for anything. She might be injured, but she was still a warrior at heart. Her grip on him tightened, not out of fear, but out of the instinct to survive. The enemy was close. Ethan could hear the rustling of leaves and the crackling of branches underfoot, the unmistakable sound of pursuit. They were being hunted. He needed to think fast. He glanced around, looking for any place to hide. Up ahead, he saw a large rock formation. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to buy them some time. He veered off the path, moving toward it with all the speed he could muster. The princess held onto him tighter, not questioning his actions but trusting him to get them to safety. When they reached the rock, Ethan ducked behind it, pulling her down with him. They crouched low, their bodies pressed together, as the sound of the enemy's footsteps grew louder. They weren't far behind now, and Ethan could see their shadows through the trees. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. The princess nodded, her eyes wide, but she didn't speak. She seemed to understand the danger. This was a moment where words didn't matter, only survival did. Ethan held his breath as he watched the enemy soldiers pass by, their armored figures moving swiftly through the forest. They were searching for the princess, scanning every tree, every bush. Ethan's pulse raced as they drew closer, but luck was on their side. They moved past the rock without noticing the hidden pair behind it. The moment the soldiers were out of sight, Ethan let out a quiet sigh of relief. His body was still tense, every muscle ready to move at a moment's notice. He looked down at the princess, her eyes meeting his, filled with gratitude. "You saved us," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time she had spoken since the chase began. "Why? Why would you risk your life for me?" Ethan hesitated, glancing back at the forest. They weren't safe yet, but he couldn't ignore her question. "I'm not just doing this for you," he said quietly. "I'm doing this for Earth. You're important. Your survival is key to winning the war." The princess looked at him, her expression serious. "I know what you think of me," she said. "I'm not just some tool to be used in a war. I'm more than that." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood what she meant. She was a leader, a princess with her own strength and pride. She wasn't just a pawn in some larger game. But for now, survival came first. "I didn't mean it like that. I need to protect you." There was a long pause. The princess said nothing, but Ethan could feel the change in the air, a shift in the tension between them. She was starting to trust him, little by little. Ethan knew they couldn't stay hidden for long. They needed to keep moving. He helped her to her feet, glancing around the area one last time before leading her forward, deeper into the forest. The chase continued. They moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows, listening for any signs of movement. Ethan's instincts were sharp, his training taking over as they moved in silence. The princess stayed close, her hand gripping his arm for support as they walked. Despite the danger, there was an unspoken bond forming between them, a shared understanding of what needed to be done. The forest seemed endless, a maze of trees and undergrowth, but Ethan pushed forward, his mind focused on the goal ahead. Every now and then, he would glance at the princess, seeing the fear in her eyes, but also the determination. She wasn't afraid to fight, but she was also smart enough to know when to rely on him. Hours passed, but the enemy never let up. They were still out there, waiting for any sign, any movement. Ethan kept pushing forward, his thoughts racing. He had no idea where the safe house was. The mission had been brief, the details vague, and now they were on their own. The princess was getting weaker. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, and she stumbled more often. Ethan knew they had to stop for a moment, but he didn't want to risk being seen. He needed to get her somewhere safe, and soon. They finally came to a small clearing. Ethan stopped, his senses alert. The sounds of pursuit were far off now, but they couldn't afford to take chances. He looked down at the princess, her silver-blue skin glowing softly in the fading light. "We need to rest for a few minutes," he said, "but we keep moving after that." The princess nodded, though her eyes remained wary. She was still processing everything: the rescue, the chase, the human who had risked his life for hers. But for now, she didn't question it. They were both in this together, and they had one goal: survival. The night was cold, and the stars barely peeked through the dense canopy of trees above. Ethan's muscles ached from running and carrying the princess for so long, but he didn't let it show. Every time he glanced at her, he saw the same fierce determination in her eyes. She wasn't giving up. He couldn't either. Not now. They had rested in the small clearing for a while, the silence of the forest wrapping around them. But the enemy could be anywhere, and every minute spent sitting still could cost them. Ethan knew they had to keep moving. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. He looked down at the princess, her silver-blue skin glowing faintly in the dim light. Despite her injuries, there was a strength in her that reminded him of something greater, something beyond the war they were in. He had seen so many soldiers, so many leaders who gave up at the first sign of danger, but she wasn't like them. She kept going, even when it seemed impossible. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Ethan hesitated, scanning the forest. The safe house was still a long way off, and the path was unclear. But they couldn't afford to stop now. The enemy could be closing in. "Not far," he lied, hoping to keep her spirits up. He didn't want her to see how worried he was. They needed hope, even if it was just a little. The princess nodded but said nothing more. Instead, she stood up slowly, her movements graceful despite the pain. Ethan was impressed. She was strong, stronger than he had expected. He had seen the way she fought back on her planet, the way she led her people. But this was different. Here, in this strange forest, surrounded by dangers, she was relying on him, and he would not let her down. They began walking again, moving cautiously through the dense trees, trying to make as little noise as possible. Ethan could feel her presence beside him, her body tense and alert, ready for anything. The night was eerily quiet, and the only sounds were the crunch of their footsteps on the forest floor and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. But then, a sound, louder this time, broke the silence. A snap of a twig. Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The princess's hand gripped his arm tighter. They weren't alone anymore. Ethan motioned for her to stay quiet and dropped to a crouch, scanning the area. The sound had come from behind them, and the enemy wasn't far. He could hear their heavy footsteps, their voices low as they searched the forest. They were getting closer. The princess looked at him, her eyes wide with fear, but her face remained calm. She was no stranger to danger, but she understood the seriousness of their situation. Ethan could feel her trust in him, and it gave him strength. He couldn't let her down. "Stay low," he whispered, pulling her gently behind a large tree. They both crouched in the shadows, their breathing shallow. The enemy soldiers were close now, their voices drifting through the trees. Ethan knew they had to make a decision, fight or run. "We can't stay here," he said softly. "We have to move before they find us." The princess nodded, and without another word, they slipped away from their hiding place, moving swiftly but quietly through the forest. Ethan led the way, using his knowledge of the terrain to navigate. They had to get to the safe house. It was their only hope. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the soldiers grew fainter. Ethan breathed a little easier, but he didn't relax. Not yet. They weren't safe. Not until they reached the safe house. The princess stumbled slightly, her strength beginning to fade. Ethan quickly caught her, holding her up. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. She nodded, though her face was pale and her breathing was labored. "I'm fine," she whispered, though it was clear she was struggling. "I just need to keep moving." Ethan looked down at her, his heart heavy. He had to admit, he wasn't sure how much longer she could go on like this. She was strong, but the injuries were taking their toll. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, and he knew she was pushing herself for him, for their mission. He couldn't let her suffer like this, not when he could do something about it. "Rest here," he said firmly, guiding her to a large rock. "I'll keep watch." The princess hesitated but finally sat down, her body sagging with relief. "I won't be long," Ethan assured her as he scanned the area, keeping watch for any signs of danger. He knew he couldn't afford to relax, but he couldn't ignore her suffering either. As he stood guard, his mind raced. The princess's trust in him was more than he could have ever expected. She had risked everything, put her life in his hands. And yet, here they were, two strangers from different worlds, fighting side by side. The feeling of responsibility weighed heavily on him. He had to keep her safe. He had promised that, and he would do whatever it took. But deep down, as he looked at the princess resting on the rock, he realized something else. He wasn't just protecting her because it was his duty. He was protecting her because he cared. The princess had become more than just the heir to an alien throne. She had become someone he couldn't imagine losing, and no matter the cost, he would make sure she survived. The night had stretched on, and the forest around them seemed to come alive with the sounds of unseen creatures. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His senses were on high alert, but the princess was still resting, her body weak from the strain of the past few hours. Despite everything, she refused to let herself show weakness. She was a fighter, and that was one of the things that drew him to her. She was more than just royalty. She was someone who understood the weight of sacrifice. Ethan moved quietly through the forest, checking the trail for any signs of danger. His mind raced as he thought about the safe house, still a long way away. The enemy had likely already passed through the area, but it wouldn't be long before they began looking for the princess again. They had to keep moving, but he wasn't sure how much farther she could go. When he returned to the princess's side, she was still sitting on the rock, her breathing shallow. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with determination. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice soft but strong. Ethan took a deep breath and glanced at the dark path ahead. "We keep moving," he said firmly. "We'll have to push through, even if it's dangerous. We can't afford to stop for too long." The princess nodded, but there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She knew the risks, and she knew how dangerous their journey had become. Still, she stood up without complaint, her body trembling from the effort. Ethan reached out to steady her, but she pulled away gently. "I can walk," she insisted, though her voice was strained. Ethan didn't argue. He knew she was determined, but he also knew that pushing herself too hard could make things worse. "We'll go slowly then," he said softly. "Just tell me if you need to stop." Together, they moved forward, one step at a time. The forest was eerily silent as they crept through the dense underbrush. The moonlight barely broke through the trees, and the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly around them. Ethan kept his eyes fixed ahead, his hand never far from his weapon, just in case the enemy appeared again. It wasn't long before they reached a clearing, a small patch of ground where the trees parted enough to allow a faint glow of moonlight to shine through. Ethan stopped, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right. The princess, too, seemed to sense it. She paused, her eyes scanning the shadows around them. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Ethan listened closely. At first, he heard nothing, but then a faint rustling sound reached his ears. It was too quiet to be anything normal. Someone, or something, was out there, and it was moving fast. Ethan grabbed the princess's arm and pulled her behind a large boulder. They crouched low, hearts pounding in their chests as the rustling grew louder. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, was unmistakable. The enemy was closing in. "We can't outrun them," Ethan said, his voice a low whisper. "We need to find a way to fight." The princess's hand tightened around his arm. "Do you have a plan?" Ethan glanced at her, his eyes hard with determination. "I do," he said, "but it's risky. If we're going to make it out of here alive, we need to take a chance." She didn't hesitate. "Tell me." Ethan took a deep breath, scanning the surrounding area for anything that could help. "There's a narrow path behind that ridge. If we can make it there without being seen, we can get some distance between us and the enemy. But we'll need to fight our way through if they catch us." The princess's gaze hardened, and she stood tall, despite her exhaustion. "I can handle it. What do we do?" Ethan's heart beat faster as he weighed the risk. "I'll create a distraction. You take out the closest soldier. We move fast, and we stay quiet. If we can get to the ridge, we'll be in the clear." The princess nodded, her expression focused and calm. There was no room for fear now, only action. Ethan trusted her completely. He glanced once more at the approaching soldiers, their shadows now visible through the trees. The time to act had come. Ethan quickly darted to the side, making enough noise to draw the soldiers' attention. He fired a warning shot into the air, just enough to make them think they had been spotted. Then, before they could react, he turned and ran in the opposite direction, leading them away from the princess. The soldiers pursued, shouting at him to stop, but Ethan didn't slow down. He knew the princess was behind him, ready to take action when the moment came. He could hear her light footsteps as she moved through the underbrush, following him, waiting for her chance. As Ethan ducked behind a tree and drew his weapon, he saw the first soldier rounding the corner. In one swift motion, the princess lunged, her weapon flashing in the moonlight. She struck him hard, taking him down before he had a chance to react. Ethan's heart raced as he fired at the other soldiers, his shots precise and quick. The forest around them seemed to explode in a blur of motion and sound. Every moment was a fight for survival. With the soldiers down, the path ahead cleared. They didn't stop to look back. They didn't have time. Together, they sprinted toward the ridge, hearts pounding in their chests. As they reached the edge of the ridge, they paused to catch their breath. The danger wasn't over, but for the first time in hours, they had gained some ground. The princess looked at Ethan, her face smeared with dirt and sweat, but her eyes sparkled with something more. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan smiled, but it was a smile full of determination. "We're not done yet," he said, "but we're one step closer." And as they continued their journey, side by side, neither of them could deny that the bond between them was growing stronger with every passing moment. They were no longer just two strangers from different worlds. They were partners in survival, bound by the dangers they faced and the trust they had built. Ethan and the princess had been running for what felt like hours, the darkness of the forest pressing in around them. They hadn't spoken much since their narrow escape. The adrenaline of the battle still lingered in their veins, making it hard to think clearly. The danger was far from over, but they had to keep moving. The path ahead was steep, and the underbrush became denser with every step they took. The princess was breathing heavily, struggling to keep up. She had been strong and resilient, but Ethan could see the exhaustion on her face. Despite her royal status and training, she was only human, no matter how much she tried to hide it. "We need to find shelter," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "If we keep going like this, we won't make it through the night." The princess nodded, her gaze flickering around as if searching for a safe place. "There's a cave not far from here," she said, her voice faint but sure. "I know the area. We can hide there until morning." Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Lead the way," he said. "We need to rest, even if it's just for a little while." They continued through the dense forest, the princess leading them with quiet confidence. Her knowledge of the land, though surprising, gave Ethan a sense of security. He trusted her instincts. Despite their differences, they had become a team, one that worked together, each complementing the other's strengths. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the cave. It was small but deep enough to offer them some shelter from the dangers of the night. Ethan stepped inside first, scanning the shadows for any signs of danger. Satisfied that it was safe, he motioned for the princess to follow. As she entered the cave, she collapsed onto the ground, her breathing still ragged from the exertion. Ethan knelt beside her, checking for any injuries. The princess winced when he touched her arm, but she didn't say anything. Ethan wasn't surprised. She was tough, but he could see the toll the journey had taken on her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. The princess nodded, though her eyes betrayed her fatigue. "I'll be fine," she said, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. I'm not used to this, to being vulnerable." Ethan sat down beside her, leaning against the cold stone wall of the cave. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, the exhaustion, the uncertainty of what was to come. They had been running for so long, fighting, hiding, and surviving. It was hard to imagine what their future would look like, if they even had a future at all. "We all have our moments of weakness," Ethan said softly, glancing at her. "No one is invincible, not even you." The princess turned her gaze toward him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand him. Her expression softened, and for a moment, Ethan saw something vulnerable in her, something raw and human. She wasn't just the alien princess anymore. She was someone who had fought to survive, just like him. "I never thought I'd end up like this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A princess, fleeing for her life in a strange world, depending on someone I don't even know." Ethan nodded, understanding more than she realized. "Life has a funny way of changing our plans," he said. "I never expected to be here either. But sometimes we have no choice but to keep going. And when you're stuck in the middle of it all, you find strength in places you never imagined." There was a long silence as they sat together in the dim light of the cave. The crackling of a small fire they'd started was the only sound that broke the stillness. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, and for the first time since their escape, Ethan allowed himself to relax, even if only for a moment. The princess shifted, pulling her knees to her chest, her face softening as she stared into the flames. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she confessed, her voice trembling. I'm scared that we won't make it, that I'll fail my people. I'm not the warrior you think I am." Ethan's heart ached as he heard the vulnerability in her voice. He could see that she wasn't just struggling with the danger they faced. She was carrying the weight of her entire world on her shoulders. The responsibility of being a princess, of leading her people, and now, the fear of failing them. "You don't have to be a warrior to be strong," Ethan said, his voice steady. "You've shown more strength than anyone I've ever known. You've kept going, even when it felt like everything was falling apart. That's what matters." The princess looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, trying to find the truth in his words. "You think so?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded, meeting her gaze. I know so. There was a quiet pause as the princess processed his words. Then she did something that surprised him. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and placed it on his arm. Ethan looked at her in surprise, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he held her gaze, waiting for her to speak. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything. I don't know what I would have done without you." Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and for a brief moment, he forgot about the dangers that still awaited them. In that moment, it was just the two of them. Two people who had found something in each other that went beyond survival. A bond that had been forged through fear, trust, and strength. "Just stay with me," he said quietly, his words full of meaning. "We'll make it through this together." The princess gave him a small, tired smile. Together. As they sat in the cave, the quiet moments stretched on, each of them finding comfort in the other's presence. The world outside was dangerous. But in this moment, they were safe, and for the first time in a long while, they allowed themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would make it through this alive. The night had passed slowly in the cave. The air was cold, but the warmth from the small fire they had built kept the chill away. Ethan lay awake for most of the night, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. Every rustling leaf, every distant animal call, made him feel uneasy. They had to move soon. Staying in one place for too long would only make them more vulnerable. The princess was asleep beside him, her chest rising and falling with slow, even breaths. Even in her sleep, her face was tense, as if the weight of her world was never far from her mind. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for her. He had promised to help her, to get her back to her people. But deep down, he wasn't sure if he was strong enough for the challenge. As the first light of dawn crept into the cave, Ethan gently shook her awake. "It's time to go," he whispered. The princess stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a brief moment, confusion crossed her face, but then reality set in, and she nodded. She didn't speak, but the quiet acceptance in her eyes told Ethan everything he needed to know. They had to keep going, no matter what. They packed up their things quickly. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the smoke drifted up to the cave's ceiling. The air outside felt fresher, but the sense of danger was still heavy. The princess moved with grace and purpose, though the exhaustion from the previous day's escape was still evident. She was a warrior, but even warriors had their limits. They left the cave and made their way back to the forest path. The trees were tall, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The world felt alive, but it was also a place of danger. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. Ethan kept a careful watch as they moved through the forest. He could feel the princess's presence beside him, a constant reminder that they were in this together. But as the hours passed, the silence between them grew. It wasn't awkward, but it was heavy, like the unsaid words hanging in the air. The princess was the first to break the silence. "Ethan," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "I have to ask you something." Ethan turned to look at her. There was something in her eyes, something that told him this was not just another question. It was important. "What is it?" he asked. She hesitated for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. "When this is over, when we're safe, what happens then?" Her eyes searched his face, as if looking for the answers he wasn't sure how to give. Ethan frowned slightly, unsure how to answer. The question had caught him off guard. What would happen after all this? They had been through so much together. But what would their lives look like when the danger had passed? Would they go their separate ways? Would their bond fade, like so many others had in the past? "I don't know," Ethan said honestly. "I didn't plan for this. I didn't plan to get involved in your fight, or to even be here. But I'm here now. And I'll do whatever it takes to help you." The princess nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I don't know either, but I've never met anyone like you. You've done more for me than I ever expected, and it's strange to feel this way, to rely on someone like this." Ethan felt a twinge of uncertainty. You're strong. You don't need anyone to save you. I know, she said with a small smile, but it's not just about saving me. It's about the trust, the choice to be together, even when the world is falling apart. Her words hit him harder than he expected. It was true. They were making choices together every step of the way. They had formed a bond that was more than just about survival. It was something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated. I didn't come here to find something like this, Ethan admitted, his voice quieter now. But I'm glad I did. The princess stopped walking and turned to face him. Her eyes were intense, as if she was trying to understand the weight of his words. She stepped closer to him, her gaze unwavering. I think I'm glad, too, she said, her voice low. More than you know. Ethan felt a shift in the air between them. It wasn't just the danger surrounding them, or the mission they had been on. It was something else, something unspoken but undeniable. He didn't know where it would lead, but he couldn't deny that in this moment, with everything they had been through, something had changed. The princess reached out, her hand brushing his arm gently. It was a simple touch, but it spoke volumes. Ethan's heart raced in his chest, and for the first time since this journey had started, he allowed himself to believe that maybe they could have a future. I'll protect you, Ethan promised, his voice firm, no matter what happens. She smiled softly, her eyes softening. And I'll protect you. Together, we're stronger. They stood there for a moment, the weight of the world still on their shoulders, but the connection between them stronger than ever. The dangers they faced were far from over, and their mission wasn't finished. But in this moment, they had something they hadn't had before: hope. With a renewed sense of determination, they continued their journey. The world was still dangerous, but together, they knew they could face whatever came next. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least they had each other. The forest seemed endless as they continued walking. The trees grew taller, their shadows stretching over the path. Every now and then, Ethan would glance over at the princess, who walked beside him. There was something different about the way she carried herself now. An air of quiet strength, but also something more. They had been through so much together. What had started as a mission to save a royal from certain death had turned into something neither of them had expected. But through it all, they had forged a bond, one that was becoming impossible to ignore. Ethan had tried to push away his feelings. He had to focus on getting them to safety. But every glance at the princess, every word she spoke, reminded him of how much he had come to care for her. There was no denying it anymore. He wasn't just helping her survive. He was hoping for a future with her. But the future was uncertain. The princess had her own people to return to, her own kingdom to reclaim. Would she even want to stay with him when everything was over? He couldn't imagine her life back in the palace, surrounded by power and responsibilities. Would she want a simple life with him, someone who had never known that kind of world? The question lingered in his mind as they pressed on, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized there was no easy answer. All he knew was that he couldn't let her go, not after everything they had shared. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples, they reached the edge of the forest. Beyond the trees, the open plains stretched out before them. They were close now. The kingdom was just beyond the horizon. I think we're almost there, Ethan said, trying to sound calm. But the nervousness in his voice was clear. The princess nodded but didn't speak. Her eyes were fixed on the distant horizon, as if she were looking for something, some sign of hope. We should rest here for a bit, Ethan suggested. We've come a long way. She agreed silently, and they set up a small camp on the edge of the plains. The last light of day faded quickly, leaving the sky dark. The air was cooler here, and the breeze carried the scent of fresh grass. As they sat by the fire, the princess spoke. Ethan, when we reach my people, what happens to us? Ethan looked at her, unsure of how to answer. He had expected this question. But now that it was here, he didn't know what to say. I don't know, he said honestly. I never thought about what would happen after. I just wanted to make sure you got home safely." The princess smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You've done that. You've done more than I could have ever asked for." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "But what about you? What happens when you're back with your people? Will you go back to your life, to the crown, and the responsibilities?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, I have a duty to my people. I have to reclaim my throne and restore peace to my kingdom." Ethan felt a pang in his chest. He knew this moment would come, the moment when she would leave. It was the way of things, and he had accepted that. But it still hurt. He had never imagined his life would become so entangled with someone else's fate. "And what about us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happens to us when you return to your kingdom?" The princess met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "I don't know," she said, "but I won't forget what you've done for me. I won't forget you." Ethan looked away, fighting the emotions rising within him. He had known this was a possibility, that they might go their separate ways once their mission was over. But it didn't make it any easier. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. The night felt heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Ethan felt the weight of everything that had passed and everything that was yet to come. The princess spoke again, her voice quiet but sure. "Ethan, I can't promise you anything. I don't know what the future holds for us. But I do know this, what we shared, what we've been through together, that will always be a part of me. And I'll always be grateful." Ethan swallowed hard. He wanted to say so many things, to tell her that he would never forget her, that he would wait for her if that was what it took. But he didn't say those words. Instead, he just nodded, understanding that some things were beyond his control. "I'll always be here for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No matter what happens." The princess smiled, a small but genuine smile that made his heart swell with warmth. "Thank you, Ethan. You've given me something I never expected. A reason to believe that there's more to this world than just duty." They sat there for a while longer, watching the fire die down to glowing embers. The night stretched on, but the uncertainty of the future seemed less daunting now. They had made it this far together, and whatever came next, they would face it with the same strength they had found in each other. As the stars above sparkled in the vast, endless sky, Ethan realized that the journey wasn't over. Their paths might have been uncertain, but one thing was clear. They had both changed, and the future, whatever it held, would be different because of it.